This video is going to take you through the initial exercise that we have in Painting 1, which is our value scale. This will prepare you to do the first painting, which is going to be a black and white value study of a still life. So we're going to start by making a 9-step value scale. We're going to mix 9 different values from black to white. Those are going to be our 2 extremes on either end of the value scale. So you can, incidentally, you can do this with any color as your dark value. You could use blue, red, green, yellow. For our purposes on this painting, we're going to use black, but the same principles would hold if you were mixing a value scale with any color. The difference being colors that are lighter in their intrinsic values, such as yellow, will have a much narrower range of values from the lightest light to the darkest dark, because the darkest dark of yellow is much lighter in value than the black. So I've got a little pile of both paints. I'm going to set my tubes aside, and I'm going to start with a little pile of white on one end. I've got my shop towel or rag that I'm going to use to keep my palette knife clean. So every time I dip my palette knife into unmixed paint, I want to make sure that it's clean so I don't contaminate. So I'm going to take a pile of black on the other end. Now the first value that I want to mix is going to be my middle gray. So in other words, that middle gray should be halfway between white and black. The difference between the middle gray and the white should be the same at the perceived difference, should be the same as the perceived difference between the middle gray and the black. So I'm going to start with white. Here I'm going to use this area here as my mixing area. So I'm going to start with white, and I'm going to add a little bit of black to that because it takes much less black to affect the value of white than it takes white to affect the value of black. So I'm going to start by mixing. When I mix 2 colors together, I'm going to take my palette knife and scrape up underneath that pile of paint to make sure I'm getting all of that unmixed paint and getting a good cohesive mix. So you can see here it is gray, but it's streaky. So if it's streaky on the palette, it'll be streaky on your painting. So you want to make sure, if you're looking for a good consistent pile of paint or value or color, you want to make sure that you mix it well on your palette before you put it on your painting. So I'll use both sides of my palette knife to mix with, making sure I get a really good clean mixture here. So if I take a little bit of that on my palette knife and compare it to the white, and then compare it to the black. So I think if I'm trying to get an even shift from the middle gray, I think I'm closer. The middle gray and the white are closer in value than the middle gray and the black. So I'm going to wipe off my palette knife. I'm going to go back to my black paint and add a little bit more. So it's a constant practice of comparing and looking and making adjustments to your palette. So you'll get used to doing this. This is the first thing that I do every day when I come into the studio, is to mix my palette. So that's closer. So I think that's a good place to start. So I've got a nice sizable pile of my middle gray. So to go from middle gray to the black, I'm going to split the difference between the 2 again. So I've got, if I have 9 boxes, I'll have 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 on either side of my middle gray. So I'm going to go to that middle one here. It's easier to split the difference of your values than it is to try to gradually move from one to the other. We have finite parameters here that we're working between, but you could if you mixed from one end to the other, you could end up with a value scale that is extremely long. So our main goal is that we want consistent changes step by step as we go from one end to the other. So I'm going to take a little bit more of my middle gray, or sorry, a little bit more black to add to my middle gray. Trying again to get midway between middle gray and black, and I'm a long way away from that. So I'm going to go back up here. I'm going to grab some more black paint. Make sure that it's really well mixed. And I've got a good consistent pile of paint here. So if I compare it to the middle gray and compare it to the black, I think I'm pretty good there. So I'm going to take some of that paint and go there. Then I'm going to take a little bit of that I just mixed, because I want to go split the difference between these two now. So I'm going to take a little bit of that gray value, and I'm going to add black to that. I think I need a little bit more black. I'll lay out some more black from my tube. So one of the things that you will get used to is putting out enough paint without putting out too much. You don't want to waste it, but you also don't want to be stingy. We want to have enough paint on the palette to be able to accomplish what we want to accomplish. Okay. I think I still need a little bit more black there. I think that will get it. So then we're going to go to our between the middle gray and that next value that we mixed. So in order to do that, to get that value, I'm going to clean my palette knife. I think I'm going to go with a little bit more of my middle gray, and then I'm going to take a little bit of that next value, because I'm trying to get midway between the two, so I'll mix those two together. This is why you want a pretty large pile of your middle gray to begin with. I still need a little bit more of my darker value. So this is sometimes the best part of my day in the studio, I'll be honest with you. Sometimes if I'm having a frustrating day, this is the part you can control, mixing your values and mixing your colors. So mixing the palette, don't ignore mixing your palette, and don't ignore getting to know your colors and your paint. Okay, so going lighter from middle gray down to our white, I'm going to take a pile of white and a little bit of the middle gray. And I've already got some of that middle gray on my palette, so I'm going to scrape that up and use it. All right, and that looks like a good step between those two. And I'm almost out of my middle gray, which might cause me a little bit of an issue. So I'm going to go back to my white, back to my black, and I'm going to try to mix that middle gray one step over from that middle gray. See how close we are. So that's pretty close to that middle gray. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to grab a little bit of white to mix with that. So you can see it's a constant back and forth, and sometimes you do have to go back and adjust your middle gray if you feel like it's not exactly right once you get the value scale developing. And that looks a little better in comparison to that middle gray, but that middle gray might be a little bit light still. So we'll go to our last value, which is the value next to white. So I'm going to take a good sizable pile of white paint. I'm going to take a little bit of that second value, and I'm going to mix those together. Let's see what we get. So to my eye on the palette, that looks really close to white. But I can tell you that you want to be really, really pretty close to that white value. So this is looking pretty good to me. The only place I think that we might have a real problem is from here to here. So in looking at the jump from this to this, I think I could probably go a tiny step darker with my middle gray and still be in between where I want to be. So the goal is that the shift from one value to the next value is consistent all the way across your value scale, so that there is a definite difference between each one, but it's not a huge difference and an obvious difference. So we want to look for those shifts in value. I'll clean up my palette a little bit so that we can really see what we've got here. So I feel pretty good about that. My next step is going to be to apply that to my canvas, and that will be in our next video.